Historians, however, have overlooked this fact, that the civil rights movement was as much a religious movement that argued on theological grounds as it was a movement to gain civic freedoms through American jurisprudence and social protests. Mays knew, as historian Joseph Crispino has argued, that the civil rights movement was an attack not simply on segregated institutions, but on the set of ideologies that supported those institutions, and by extension on white Southerners' theological worldview. The religious nature of the Southern civil rights struggle forced white Southerners to explain anew the relationship between their Christian faith and their segregationist practices. This study then explores the linkages between the civil rights movement as a movement for democratic social change and its religious dimension through the personality of Mays. Mays used his ideas, born of religious faith and struggle, as an oppositional force against white supremacy in order to build up an African-American communal interest. He was, to use a theoretical phrase authored by Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist theory, an organic intellectual. Mays' thought, as reflected in sermons and writings, arose out and responded to the communal institution that shaped him, the segregated South, the Christian church in its manifestation among African Americans, and black-led educational institutions in the South. Because Mays was so organic to these institutions, it has been easy for historians of both religion and intellectual history to overlook him and his cohort of black religious intellectuals whose writings were directed toward African American audiences. Dominating the historical studies of black intellectuals and cultural life in the 20th century have been the publications about great black literary figures and the great giant of African American thought, W.E.B. Du Bois. These studies are important contributions and correctives to the fields of cultural and intellectual history. However, what has been long missing in these historical monograms has been the perspective of African American religious intellectuals. African Americans were, to state the case amicably, and still are today, deeply religious, and intellectuals like Mays tried to reshape their faith, understanding, and social aspirations. Arguably, black religious intellectuals had a greater audience and influence on the lives of ordinary black people than many other and more widely acclaimed black theorists and literary figures who have received a great deal of ink in the academy. For example, Mays regularly spoke to the National Baptist Convention, which represented nearly 3 million people. One of the largest denominations in the country. At every gathering of the National Baptist Convention where Mays was often invited to speak, he touched the lives of thousands to 10,000s of people who went to those conventions. It is my contention that Mays, as a subject of historical scrutiny, has been lost to readers of the 20th century America because in the main he wrote about the black Protestant churches and published a great deal in numerous church-affiliated periodicals. And although he was quite critical of both black and white American Protestant churches for their equivocation and complicity in perpetuating American racism, he nevertheless remained largely a bit role player as an intellectual voice within the civil rights movement because his career was spent in the South, in the confines of all black religious and educational institutions. Mays' genius was his ability to remain at the epicenter of ordinary black life as an intellectual clergyman, an educator, and a proponent of calling for the overthrow of white supremacy in the United States. Unlike many black writers, scholars, and public intellectuals of his generation who distanced themselves from black religiosity and black colleges for a myriad of important reasons, Mays chose to be a committed and critical insider within the black Protestant church community and to serve as a leader of a culturally conservative, all-black institution of higher education. I want to tell you this story about Mays. Mays and Faulkner, William Faulkner, that never made the paper. William Faulkner, Benjamin Mays, and a lawyer were to meet at the Southern Historical Association meeting in 1955 on a panel at the Peabody Hotel in downtown Memphis. Now, the Peabody Hotel staff was quite worried about this meeting because they thought that the White Citizens Council would get a hold of this, and if a picture were taken with Mays sitting next to Faulkner on the stage, this would be quite something, and they thought they would be run out of business. So no cameras were allowed in the building, and only journalists who could come in were ones who were writing. Benjamin Mays got up to speak at that meeting, and he gave a talk called the Morality of Segregation, in which he got a 10-minute standing ovation. Faulkner, I love Faulkner, they tried to keep him sober. They gave him just a little bit of shots, so he wouldn't stagger, and was so overwhelmed by the speech he could barely say anything and talked in a whisper. The New York Times reported the story that Faulkner had talked about segregation and was brilliant, never mentioning Benjamin Mays had stole the show. And all the black people, the servants who had worked and the domestic workers who worked at that hotel were there, and about 5 other black historians. That's how he was marginalized in the press. Another thing that makes Mays' intellectual journey so important for us, and it bears repeating, is that his voice was distinctively Southern and black. A great deal of emphasis has been placed on the intellectual primacy of black intellectual thought and cultural production centered in New York City and the northeastern corridor of the United States, that it is nearly forgotten that there are and were regional variations of African American thought and cultural attitudes. We still see this today. As Mays informed a Christian Science reporter, "I've been a Southerner all my life." For him, being a Southerner meant having roots to the rural and agrarian cultural traditions of the South, being positively oriented to the communal ties of family and religions, which were a derivative of the ties of slave community, and understanding that it would have to be Southern blacks who would in the end have to resist racism in terms that brought the entire Southern region out of its Jim Crow doldrums. Sometimes I just think we forget that there are different voices within black communities. Black communities, as I inform my students today, are heterogeneous. They are not monolithic, and regional variations of those voices. So black Southerners may tend to appear more conservative than a black New Yorker or even a black kid who had spent his childhood in New Orleans. The historian Bruce Kuckluck has shown that mainstream and overwhelmingly white and male and white-dominated American academy of the 18th and 19th century were led by Protestant clergymen. Kuckluck argues that white clergymen dominated the academy. Even the University of Kansas was founded from mainstream Protestants of the day. But one of the things Kuckluck's analyst history forgets is that African American religious intellectuals like Mays were in continuum with this earlier pattern, and where great American clergymen who served as vital thinkers and educational leaders in small colleges and universities throughout the United States.